Great. Thank you very much, Tomiura-san, and thank you to Rieti for hosting me and for everybody for tuning in during your lunch break here in Japan and elsewhere. So today, look, I want to talk about the increasing risks to trade and investment internationally as the geopolitical tensions rise and other risks continue to increase, and the threat to the international rules-based economic order. Then I really want to focus a bit on how middle powers can mobilize collective action to deal with that. So I want to start with really a debate that's been going on for centuries. And here we've got these two handsome gentlemen, Montesquieu, the French philosopher, as well as Adam Smith, who present different sides of this debate, which really isn't a debate, as I'll explain, but in explaining whether trade is a source of peace or conflict. And Montesquieu is often quoted as saying peace is a natural effect of trade. He goes on to say, two nations who traffic with each other become reciprocally dependent. And this is what we're familiar with most of all here in Japan, in East Asia, and what we've enjoyed largely through this rules-based economic order. That's the commercial piece. Deeper economic interdependence and integration increases the cost of conflict, and it's the basis of the European project, of course, this idea. And for East Asia, for here in Japan with China, but more broadly across Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, trade has been a source of prosperity as well as security. Now, that's Montesquieu. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations says, well, it ought to be, but in fact it isn't. Trade has become the most fertile source of discord and animosity. And here we can see current day US-China relationship, and this is structurally so, has been so for a while now, but other relationships where deepened economic interdependence has become seen as a vulnerability. So high trade shares open you up to vulnerability and sensitivity if that interdependence is weaponized. So throughout history and even in the present day, we can find examples of both of these where trade is a source of peace or trade can become a source of conflict. So who is right? Well, of course, it depends on the regime. And it depends on the regime within which countries are engaged. So the post-war rules-based international economic order, there was confidence in that order and countries signing up to the rules because the United States enforced those rules, led the enforcement of those rules. And that helped mitigate risks. Of course, when countries trade, firms trade, there's always going to be risk, but under a rules-based system, a lot of those risks can be mitigated. But now the United States has gone from enforcer to spoiler of that system. And we have a weakened system where there hasn't been a complete loss of confidence, nothing like that, but with weaponization of trade and interdependence and a little bit less confidence in this regime, companies and countries are having to self-insure with economic security policies. We're all familiar with some of the measures such as trade, investment diversification, stockpiling, onshoring, friendshoring, and so forth. So these are done to mitigate these risks that previously were mitigated under a multilateral rules-based order. So in this sense, the Montesquieu idea of prosperity and security being complements, or the Adam Smith realization that sometimes they can be seen as substitutes, I think there's a very big difference between these two. And how can we maintain an equilibrium and a regime where prosperity and security are complements and have a virtuous cycle between the two, and avoid a vicious cycle of trade, investment becoming less important and trade becoming less interdependent, economies becoming less interdependent, and having a less constraint on political relationships. So the virtuous cycle, of course, between Japan and China where the politics has been constrained between the two countries, as both countries, especially China since 2001, signed up to the established rules and norms. So the simple model in economics of guns or butter, as economic growth or manufacturing weapons, for example, and security, we can, over time, a dynamic view of this is to see it as guns and butter. And I'll come back to that, try to think through a simple model. But before I do, I think it's worth just going back to what this post-war economic order is and what it looks like, why it's been so important. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, that became the WTO, and the other Bretton Woods institutions were negotiated during the Second World War, and very much had security, not just economic liberalism, in mind. And that was to avoid, of course, the economic rivalry, protectionism of the 1930s that fed insecurity and conflict, helping fuel conflict later in the Second World War. So those principles were very important. Now, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that kicked these off in 1930, of course, were not very high by US standards at that time, but the difference then, as to before, was retaliation from other countries. So the kind of levels we're talking about of peaks of close to 60% and average tariffs from the United States of 20% are not unheard of, coming out of President Trump as threats today. Yet it was a retaliation from other countries that pushed the global economy into further, into a deeper Great Depression. So that system that was negotiated, and especially the GATT when it comes to thinking about trade, allowed the insulation, separation of trade and economic policy from high politics or national security. Of course, allowing countries that sign up to this system, this order, to enjoy deepening of economic relations despite the politics and letting the economics dominate the politics. And that open global order, economic order, has been, I think, under-recognised, underappreciated as a source of security. This system we have now, of course, is under threat, and it's weakened substantially, but it's far from dead. It's not dead. It still protects countries from coercion, and a case in point here is the Australian experience with China. Australian producers hit by trade sanctions, unable to export goods into their until then largest market, China, were able to find alternative buyers in an open global economy with a lot of alternative buyers and suppliers. That idea of a level playing field or most favoured nation, equal treatment, meant we had, and we still have, open contestable markets that diffuse economic and therefore diffuse political power. So the WTO, with its reference point against protectionism, still acts to blunt the use of economic weapons. In fact, I'll come back to this, but the WTO, despite its state it's in with rules in the dispute settlement system being unenforceable, for a small group of countries they are, and that system still acted as the exit ramp for Australia and China from that episode of trade sanctions. But now, of course, the security imperative is weighed against the economic imperative for many countries, and rightly so. The security risks are on the rise. So we have a situation where we have more trade sanctions, export controls, a lot of other economic sanctions that we've seen, and the weaponisation of economics. That has become quite widely used, this idea of weaponisation of economics, but so have ideas like geoeconomics that bring geopolitics together with what's traditionally been trade policy or economic policy internationally. And this use of economics as a weapon and weaponising trade, weaponising interdependence, or the securitisation of international economic policy, has caused economic interdependence to be seen as a source of vulnerability, instead of, as I said before, in East Asia and in Europe, for example, seeing economic interdependence as a source of prosperity and security. And a couple of factors here make this even more complicated and act to stop the protection of the WTO against this kind of weaponisation, and that is the WTO dispute settlement system no longer able to enforce rules through the appellate body, that's since 2019, but a group of countries, including the European Union, Canada, Australia and others, including China, quickly in 2020 set up a MPIA, multi-party interim arbitration arrangement. I think I'm missing one of the A's there, but replicated the system in a plurilateral arrangement outside of the current system, consistent with the rules. Japan joined that and is a member, and gradually the membership grows. Still less than 1/3 of the WTO membership can enforce rules, trade rules with each other. And of course, the security exception in the GATT, Article 21, has been let loose. So when the system was negotiated, of course, there had to be a security exception for being able to restrict trade when countries are at war with each other, for example, to preserve sovereignty and policy space. That understanding has been let loose now with the abuse of the security exception, making things much more complicated. And we need to find a way to get that system back into its box. Add to that, we're dealing with, I think, the other big structural challenge is great power strategic competition. This is where especially the United States has gone from caring about absolute gains, how much the United States grows, regardless of what happens in China really, to now focused on relative gains, how much the United States is growing relative to China. And that's a zero-sum game. One side's gain, so China's gain, is seen as a loss to the United States. And I should say that China has reciprocated in kind, and these two great powers are locked into this zero-sum competition. Now, we're used to economic competition where countries compete by improving infrastructure, productivity, investing in education, and gaining competitiveness in that sense is good for each country, but it also has positive spillovers. It's good for other countries as well. Strategic competition is one where it's all seen in zero-sum terms and in relative gains, and you start to implement policies that in fact hurt yourself to hurt the other country. And there are a lot of unintended consequences, and some countries are pointing economic weapons at themselves, restricting trade, investment, in the name of this getting ahead. There can only be one number one in a fight between or competition between China and the United States, and this sort of competition leads to economic coercion, unilateral sanctions. In the case of the United States, of course, putting sanctions on advanced semiconductor manufacturing in China that affects other countries. And of course, Chinese use of economic sanctions for non-economic reasons, or for any reason, is increasing appetite for the great powers to ignore the rules when it suits them and to force countries to choose sides. And this is where this idea of de-risking, I think, is, well, decoupling at least, turned to de-risking, but I would argue that without a functioning rules-based system that mitigates those risks, the idea of de-risking will lead to decoupling as the most rational outcome. And that's a very damaging outcome, I think, economically, but of course politically for large parts of the world, but the global economy generally. So that leads me to this prisoner's dilemma, and if you haven't seen a prisoner's dilemma payoff matrix in a while, a bit of a refresher. I won't spend too much time on this. But this is where the sort of rational choices for both countries, and we can assume that the United States and China being rational, are to contain. So the payoffs here from cooperation are 5 units and 5 units. This is an exaggeration for illustrative purposes. But you go through every policy choice, cooperate or contain. For the United States, if depending on what you think the Chinese will do, your dominant strategy is to contain. And same for China. China has a dominant strategy, and you end up in a prisoner's dilemma equilibrium where both countries are trying to contain each other, locked into strategic competition, and you're both doing worse off when you could both be doing better off. Now, the problem here is this is gradually generalizing to an epic fail equilibrium, what my co-author Danny Quah and I have called this epic fail equilibrium, where other countries are joining in, this zero-sum game that's actually leading to negative-sum outcomes, and the global economy has been on this trajectory, largely led by US-China strategic competition, towards instability, uncertainty, and led by security concerns. Of course, everybody's becoming worse off. So I think it's worth just illustrating this with a simple model to look at the payoffs or the interaction between economics and security, or prosperity and national security, and some implications of a loss of confidence in the multilateral trading system. So, of course, I'm not downplaying national security risks. They are legitimate, but what I'm going to argue against is needing a balance between managing and mitigating national security risks, balancing those against the needs of societies, but also of economic interests. And that's because I think a lot of national security risks we can think of are existential, of course, and they're assigned an infinite price. That is, no amount of prosperity is worth catastrophic security outcomes. So we retreat to what we call in economics corner solutions. And these tail risks need to be dealt with, of course, but they cannot dominate policy making. Otherwise, as we see in the simple sort of trade-off, you can think of this as a production possibilities frontier. And sometimes there are harsh substitutes or trade-offs between security and prosperity. But you can see, of course, there are a number of options, and we'll have to see what sort of indifference curves or utility curves countries deal with. But quite often it's not going to be that corner solution. So you can think of this as maybe we're not at the frontier in a lot of countries, in a lot of policy issues, and you can improve both security outcomes and prosperity by moving towards that frontier. So that's a fairly simple idea. There are policies that improve security outcomes and make you better off economically. I think that's very easy to understand. There are policies that make you less secure and poorer as well, move you towards that centre origin, point of the origin. Of course, if you move towards this corner solution, that's where North Korea is at, even moving towards that. I don't know that that necessarily makes you safer in the long run, but that's an extreme. But it's also some countries are choosing policies, moving them towards that corner solution. But also, if you're in a world of containing another country, for example, if the United States' containment strategy of China gathers steam with other countries joining, you can push other countries towards a corner solution. And that, I don't think, bodes well. And I want to come back to this later about undoing interdependence and the risks there. I think there's a powerful economic and security imperative to having high degrees, relatively high degrees of economic interdependence. But also, this is not a static world. We can expand strategic policy space and we can narrow strategic policy space. Now, the way I would think about this perhaps is with international cooperation. In this part of the world, we can think about not just trade agreements, but arrangements like ASEAN and ASEAN-centred arrangements from Southeast Asia that include Japan, Australia and others. That kind of cooperation, multilateral cooperation, can expand policy options. But if there's fragmentation and disorder in the global system, that is going to narrow strategic policy space for countries. So this is a fairly simple stylistic model, but I think it can help us think through, well, of course there are policies that improve security and prosperity, and there are policies that make us less secure and poorer, and how to think about sometimes it is a trade-off, a one-to-one trade-off perhaps between security and prosperity, but other times we can use international cooperation to expand our policy options. So under a robust multilateral trading system with confidence in that system from countries, we of course have more strategic policy space. When we're in a world where there's fragmentation and disorder, economic coercion, one-on-one with great powers, that's a world of rule by power and might instead of rule by law. So happy to hear sort of reactions to that. Now, thinking about now how to respond to these circumstances and how the rest of the world, minus China and the United States, might respond to this world where we're on a trajectory from bad to worse. A number of options, of course, policymakers, our communities are demanding from our governments, policymakers are undertaking, like diversifying trade. That sounds very sensible. If you're thinking about managing a financial portfolio, diversification is generally good, diversifying risk. And of course, when you're hit by big shocks, Japan and the energy oil shock, for example, in the 70s and later 80s, diversifying sources of energy. These are obvious responses. But I raise a question, it's a legitimate question about diversification of trade and the limits to that. So diversifying trade can be seen as the opposite of specialisation and the gains from trade, the opposite of what has made us rich, specialisation in comparative advantage and benefiting from economies of scale. So how much of this diversification is to manage real risks, but how much are we going to be giving up in the meantime? I think that's a very important question, as we will need much more specialisation, realisation of comparative advantage and economies of scale to affect the green energy transition, for example. And related to this question is how to manage concentrated markets or high trade shares. This is seen by many countries as a security risk in some commodities, rare earths, critical minerals, for example, to have high trade shares and depend heavily on China is seen as not just an economic risk, but a risk more broadly to security interests. Now, how do we manage that? That sort of relates to the first question, and I honestly don't know the answer. We used to not worry about this so much when we're dealing with countries within a robust multilateral rules-based system where we have confidence that countries are restrained by the rules, enforceable rules. But now, with a loss of some confidence in that system, these high trade shares are seen as a risk and something that needs to be managed. Yet again, I think we're going to need some concentrated markets and some high trade shares to manage a green transition. So those are two big questions for me that I think outline a bit of a research agenda for myself going forward anyway. I think also to think about security differently. I'll start with the second point first. Zero-sum, quite often security is thought of in zero-sum terms, but not always, and it probably should be limited more to territorial disputes where one side's gain is seen as a loss to the other, and of course war. But in areas like the competition for technology or technological supremacy, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum or negative-sum game. Surely there can be positive-sum outcomes. And this is where concepts, ideas like collective security, if you're in the same security agreement or alliance, of course that is all positive-sum. How do you change the equation so that you can expand that kind of thinking to have more positive sum security arrangements, or of course to think about security more broadly, like Japan and Southeast Asia have done with this idea of comprehensive security, Sogo Anzen Hosho. This, of course, doesn't just take the narrow military security view, but economic security, energy security, climate security, human security. These are all very important, and to think about these as mutually enforcing and complementary, not substitutes to be played off one for the other. And this is where I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the power of economic interdependence as a little bit of retreat here from high trade shares seems rational, retreat from a more unpredictable and uncertain global environment, especially with non-allies, looks sensible, looks like the right policy decision. Where does this lead us? Well, we're in a very different world now, of course, from the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Union and the West, where the United States is locked into strategic competition with China, and a China that is deeply interdependent with this part of the world, but in fact the global economy. The Soviet Union, of course, was not interdependent with the global economy. So the reorganization of supply chains, the restrictions in the United States, the tariffs against Chinese imports, have rearranged value chains. The interdependence directly between China and the United States has fallen, but a lot of those value chains are now V-shaped and going through third markets, Vietnam, Mexico, Thailand, India, and others, of course. And a working hypothesis, I think, that would be recognized in Japan especially, is a Chinese economy and society that is less integrated into the global economy is one with more risks, not less risks. So there's no doubt that there's no question that the private market is prevalent in China, and foreign invested firms have a large presence and are exporting and are part of China's integration into the global economy. We may not like the direction that the Chinese economy is going in domestically, but unwinding the interdependence I don't think makes us safer. I think it's one that increases risks. So the global market is a constraint on the Chinese economy. And you may ask about, well, Europe's mistake in dependence on Russian gas, or this idea of economic interdependence, raising the costs of conflict, going back to Montesquieu, and the commercial peace. That didn't work out with Russia. Well, that's true, but I think European dependence on Russian gas is completely different from Chinese complex interdependence with regional value chains, global value chains. And in fact, even in that case, Germany, with its heavy reliance on Russian gas and energy, did not go into recession. It was able to weather the storm and use market forces to deal with that. So these raise some pretty big questions, I think, for thinking about policy strategies in the long term. But before I get to some strategies on how to mobilize cooperation and collective action by middle powers, I just want to think about, well, how can we restore economics in the global order? What are the kind of priorities for preserving the established system? Now, there's a lot that works about the established system, but a lot that doesn't. The WTO and the multilateral trading system, even with the free trade agreements, regional agreements, plurilaterals, the rules are out of date. Now, we're busily updating those from the bottom up in smaller agreements, plurilaterals, regionals, and bilaterals. But we do need to reform the system and preserve the system. To think that the system is dead, which it isn't, and then to try to start from scratch would ignore the security benefit we have from the current system and how important the current system still is for protecting the global economy, especially middle powers and small powers. So we of course need new rules for industrial policy, industrial subsidies, need new rules for digital economy and technology. These are all areas we've needed new rules for a long time and have been the source of conflict between China and a lot of the rest of the world. Of course, many economies that are already members of this multi-party interim arbitration arrangement have the WTO rules as enforceable, and that, as I said, has helped a lot of resolution peacefully of trade conflicts. I think that we need to continue to appeal to those rules and encourage other countries to join. And we need to work in groups of countries that are willing to, whether it's regionally, plurilaterally, to plug this security exception in the WTO. How we might codify what's accepted and what's not, now that it's been let out of the bag. So we're in this world of bottom-up rulemaking, and we'll need multilateral principles to guide the arrangements that we make plurilaterally, regionally. And I think some of those are obvious, to have open accession to agreements, making sure they can expand membership. But there's a question about what the limits of that are. Minilateral arrangements, as they're called outside of economics largely, of like-minded or trusted partners, do they not make the world smaller? A sort of friend-shoring approach. It's very difficult first to figure out who your friends are in that kind of world, but it does make the world much smaller. You lose a number of alternative buyers and suppliers. And there needs to be ways to incentivise and accommodate great power cooperation. So again, Danny Quah, who I've mentioned, talks about nudging the great powers. How can collectively the middle powers do this? And I think it's fair to say that we can expect the United States to be inactive in the multilateral trading system, in fact a source of uncertainty in that system for the foreseeable future. So how do we mobilise collective action in that reality? Many countries did in Trump 1.0 sign bilateral deals that got them out of the doghouse, got them out of the firing line, but in fact were arrangements that weakened and were inconsistent with the existing rules. Now they act to weaken the order that we're trying to protect, that will be the ultimate protection for these countries. So we have bridgeheads of multilateralism in this part of the world that help lock the Chinese into more markets and more rules. A lot of those are ASEAN-centred. And it's probably worth thinking about how to mobilise ASEAN-centred European arrangements as a response to these new circumstances. But how might we do so, and what are the modes of that cooperation? Well, this is where I think there are a number of different ideas. This is an active area for research, where I think forging consensus or building frameworks to help guide cooperation is extremely important. Danny Quah speaks of inadvertent cooperation and nudging great powers. Adam Posen has written about principled plurilateralism, gives examples of CPTPP, MPIA. CPTPP, of course, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Arrangement, 12 countries, including the United Kingdom, that no longer doesn't have the United States in. These are important ideas, including constructive incrementalism from Mari Pangestu and Merit Jano, that you can see are moving in the same direction of encouraging that bottom-up cooperation to substitute for a sort of top-down leadership from the United States in the multilateral trading system. I think an area that is most prospective for this particular set of circumstances we're in is going back to the idea of concerted unilateralism, really from Peter Drysdale and Ross Garnaut. But Yamazawa Ippei here in Japan was a big proponent of this, as was Heidi Sasastro in Indonesia and others, where we know from APEC the success of this sort of cooperation, where countries work unilaterally, doing what's in their own interest, but do so in concert. So the gains are compounded. The examples of this are, of course, the Bogor goals from 1994 in APEC of aiming for free and open trade and investment, a very vague goal in the future, which gave countries an organising target to organise their unilateral action, where countries agreed it's in their own interest to open up to trade and investment for development and for economic growth, but to do so collectively or in concert meant the benefits were much larger. This is how also the Paris Climate Agreement works, where you do not have binding treaties or targets, but you encourage unilateral action. And the result of this is openness to non-members of these arrangements, and by avoiding the sort of negative spillovers and economic diversion. For the economists, this helps manage the positive spillovers and the free rider problem, because you're doing so with other countries as well. And this is where I'll conclude with a proposal, an idea to help mobilise this sort of cooperation, this kind of concerted unilateral action. Now, to think about what the organising goal might be for this sort of action, with the United States withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, I think the imperative of the green transition might be something that might help organise collective action and provide a framework for countries to work together. Or, in fact, instead of work together, do what's in their own interest, but towards a common goal. So that necessarily requires an open trading system, an openness to goods trade and investment in green goods, for example. It requires a lot of domestic regulation to be harmonised with other countries. So coming to agreement that it's in these countries' interests, in Southeast Asia, for example, where you think around an ASEAN initiative, this could be organised and connected to a European initiative, might have some chance of success as a new set of Bogor goals. That helped, Bogor goals helped mobilise and drive action and manage the positive externalities. This, in fact, idea would help manage the positive externalities as well for the groups of countries who see the green energy transition imperative as something that needs to be protected, that relates closely to the trade and investment policy agenda. So Tomino-san, I might stop there, thank you, and I look forward very much to the discussion.